Thank you, Mr. Corelliuson, and good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon to everyone on the webcast. It's great to be back. It's been a while since we've been in this congregation, but it's wonderful to see everybody here today for the potluck, and hopefully we'll have a really nice gym night afterwards as well. If you turn with me to Romans chapter 7. Romans chapter 7. Very important passages here. Romans chapter 7. And I'll start in verse 7, Romans 7:7. Breaking into a thought the Apostle Paul is making here. It says, what shall we say then? Is the law sin? Well, what law is he talking about? He's talking about traffic laws, talking about tax laws. What law is he talking about? Is the law sin? Well, certainly not. On the contrary, I would not have known sin except through the law. For I would not have known covetousness unless the law had said, you shall not covet. So he gives an example of the law he's talking about. He's talking about the 10 Commandments. That's the law he's talking about. The 10 Commandments help define what sin is. You break the 10 Commandments, that's sin. So he's talking about the 10 Commandments here. And if you drop down to verse 12, it said, therefore the law, the 10 Commandments, it's holy, and the commandment holy, just, and good. So this is great so far. Most everybody is together on this. But if you drop down to verse 14, it says, for we know the law is spiritual. Spiritual. Okay. That can cause a problem for some people, especially in the world. I mean, the Bible says the 10 Commandments are a spiritual law. And as such, they will last forever, because something as spirit can't be destroyed, right? Physically, I mean, it's going to last forever. But the question I pose is, how could the weekly seventh-day Sabbath be observed eternally when it is now tied to the physical Earth's rotation? You know, that this is one of the problems. Most people in the world, they can sort of go along with most of the 10 Commandments, but the Sabbath, it's a stumbling block for them because it's physical. It's 24 hours on the earth. Well, this sermon hopefully will give food for thought on this one aspect of the Sabbath command. How can the Sabbath be observed eternally? So I have three main points. First point, God's commandments all currently have a physical component, and they also have a spiritual meaning. God's commandments all currently have a physical component, and they also have a spiritual meaning. Now, most Bible-believing Christians can understand from Jesus' teaching in the Sermon on the Mount that murder, which is now tied to physically killing someone else with evil intent, has a spiritual component. How much do we allow ourselves to dislike another person? That's that spiritual aspect. You really don't like a person, and you just really, really, really don't like them. That comes to become hatred in our heart. Even though we do not physically kill someone, is the same as murder in God's eyes. Jesus explained that starting in Matthew chapter 5, verse 21. Likewise, adultery. Adultery is a physical act of sexual relations with a person not your spouse. But Jesus explained starting in Matthew 5, verse 27, that the thought process of looking on another person who is not your spouse with the desire to have relations with them is spiritual adultery. The weekly Sabbath is one day of physical rest and worship of God that occurs every 7 days. It is a 24-hour period that moves depending on where you are on the earth's surface. For instance, I will still be observing Holy Sabbath time when people in Australia have long since finished the Sabbath in their area. So how can this moving window of time be more than a physical period of time connected to Earth's rotation? How can the physical Sabbath command be spiritual or eternal? The description of the Sabbath in Leviticus 23 gives us a clue to how the current physical weekly seventh-day Sabbath command can have an eternal and spiritual aspect, much like we saw with the commandments on murder and adultery. Let's go back to Leviticus 23, and we'll have our second major point. The second major point is that the Sabbath and all of the holy days in Leviticus 23 are appointed times set by God. All of them are appointed times set by God. So it is logical to understand that there is an analogy in the spirit realm for holy time as well. Let's start in Leviticus 23. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel and say to them," now we're going to be analyzing these next few verses pretty closely. It says in the New King James, it says, "The feast of the Lord, which you shall proclaim to be holy convocations, these are my feasts." Well, actually that word that's translated feast here is from the Hebrew word moed. Moed. And that's from Strong's 4150, and it means appointed times or appointed meetings of the Lord. So all of the following holy days are appointed times here in Leviticus 23. They're appointed times of God. Who appointed them? Well, God did. And we understand it is God who desires to meet with his physical people on these appointed times. We are to present ourselves before God on these appointed times. That's what a moed, it's an appointed time, it's an appointed meeting. He chose the times and days. We must choose whether or not we will respond or not and be there. We do not have the authority to change those God-appointed times. Notice that these moed are also called mikra, and that's from Strong's 4744. They're mikra kodesh, or holy convocations or assemblies. Mikra is an assembly. So if we sort of reread Leviticus 23, verse 2, "The appointed times of the Lord, which you shall proclaim to be holy assemblies, holy convocations, these are my appointed times." Now, God's physical people are to assemble together to meet with him on these appointed times. And we understand the general caveat. If a person's sick or physically unable to assemble, okay. But in general, we are to come together and appear, present ourselves before God when he has made a set time. So after this chapeau in verses 1 and 2, you get to verse 3. And it's repeating the Sabbath command. 6 days shall work be done, but the seventh day is a Sabbath of solemn rest, a mikra chodesh, a holy assembly, a holy convocation. You are commanded to appear. You shall do no work on it. It's the Sabbath of the Lord in all of your dwellings. So it's a sacred assembly. It's an appointed time, or moed, as we saw in verse 2. And like I said, before I go any further, the word moed's translated feasts several times in this chapter. And that obscures the meaning a bit. See, there's another Hebrew word for feast. And this is called Hag. So if you go to Israel and when you say feast greetings, you say Hag Sameah, feast joy. There are technically only 3 feasts in Leviticus 23, as well as Deuteronomy 16. These are the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Hag of Unleavened Bread, the Feast of Weeks, the Hag of Weeks, and the Feast of Tabernacles. All the other special days in Leviticus 23 are moed, or appointed times or meetings. So if you go to verse 4, these are the moed, the appointed times of the Lord, mikra kodesh, holy assemblies, which you shall proclaim at their moed, their appointed times. And then it talks about the 14th day of the first month at twilight is the Lord's Passover. So that is a moed. God desires to meet with his people at that time. It is not a feast per se. You drop down to verse 23. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel, saying, in the 7th month, on the first day of the month, you'll have a Sabbath rest, a memorial of blowing of trumpets," is how it's said, but it's really Yom Teruah, a day of shouting. And it is a Mikra Kodesh, an assembly, a sacred assembly. Okay, it's not a feast per se. And then Day of Atonement, also, you drop down to verse 27, it is a holy convocation, a Mikra Kodesh. It's a holy assembly, but it's not a feast per se. So we see that these are appointed times. They're times that God has designated that we are to appear, to present ourselves before him. Third point, do we see assemblies in the spirit world? Do we see that in the Bible? Now, if God sets a time in the spirit realm and commands his created spirit sons, which we generally call angels, to present themselves, would they come? Or would the angels and maybe demons say, well, you know what, I think I will come see you another time when I want to come? Do you think they really would do that? Well, there are many places in the Bible where we can see assemblies with God around his throne, and even evil spirits are shown to be present. Let's look at a few of those assemblies in Job chapter 1. Job chapter 1. Job chapter 1, verse 6. Now there was a day, so there was a time. Again, we're not necessarily talking about a day on earth, but a time period, a time when the sons of God, who were the sons of God? Well, these were the Beni Elohim. These are the created sons of God, spirit beings. The sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord. And Satan also came among them. And the Lord said, well, where did you come from? So it's interesting, this word, they present themselves before the eternal. That's from Strong's 3320, the Hebrew word yatsab. And yatsab means to present oneself as a servant or courtier with readiness for service. So again, without going into a lot of other detail that's extraneous to this presentation, it seems like the devil, or Shaitan, he had a function that he was supposed to be doing, and God was sort of asking him, well, what are you doing your function? What are you doing? You know, but he's there. He's there before the eternal with the other created sons of God. Job chapter 2, verse 1. Again, there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord. And Satan came also among them to present himself for the Lord. So we can pose a question, how is time figured in the spirit realm? Well, we don't know. We don't know. Because time in this universe is related many times to the rotation of heavenly bodies or vibrations of atoms and things like that. But we know there was a spirit realm before there was an earth. Job 38, verses 1 through 7 explains that. So there has to be a way to count time in the spirit world apart from the earth's rotation or the movement of the stars. Thus, if all the 10 commandments are spiritual, as Romans 7, verse 14 says, then there must be a way for God to have regular, recurring assemblies in the spirit world in spiritual dimensions for all of his created sons, and we generally call them angels, and his spirit-born sons and daughters, eventually us. The fate of the devil and the fallen angels is what? Let's go back to Revelation 12. Revelation 12 and verse 8. What is their fate? And again, we get clues throughout different passages in the Bible. But Revelation 12, I'll start in verse 7. It says, war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought with the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought, but they did not prevail, nor was a place found for them in heaven any longer. They were cast out. The fate of the devil and the fallen angels is to be cast out of heaven, and no place is found for them there anymore. Being cast out will make it impossible for them to assemble before God. They will be cut off from keeping the sacred assembly before God. And the Church of God understands that Jude, verse 13, says, those fallen angels are wandering stars for whom is reserved the blackness of darkness forever. If we humans forsake the assembling of ourselves on the appointed times of God, particularly the weekly Sabbath day, we also will cut ourselves off from God, and we also will wander in spiritual darkness until our death. So this is one huge reason why it is so important to be at Sabbath services, the sacred assembly, the appointed time set by God every week, if at all possible. So let's summarize. We have seen that God's commandments all currently have a physical component. They also have a spiritual meaning, and Jesus elaborated the spiritual meaning of a few of those commandments in the Sermon on the Mount. We saw that the Sabbath and all the holy days of Leviticus 23 are appointed times, or moed, and they're set by God. So it's logical to understand that there could be an analogy in the spirit realm for holy time or appointed times. We also saw that there are assemblies in the spirit realm, and I just covered two, but there's several more in the Bible. There are assemblies in the spirit realm where the created sons of God present themselves before God. So in conclusion, a simple understanding of one aspect of the spiritual meaning of the Sabbath command is that we will continue to have meetings with God and Jesus Christ at regular intervals forever, however time is counted in the spirit world. How wonderful it is for us that eventually, as spirit-born sons and daughters of God, we will have a recurring opportunity to come before our loving Father in Jesus Christ, to talk with them, to hear from them, and renew and strengthen our family bond in love forever.